bearing selection process. I'm going to go through what software programs that SKF has available online, mostly, that are really handy when it comes to making your bearing lubrication and whole arrangement selections. Some of these are a bit more complicated than others, so I'll also say sort of which ones I would recommend to use at certain times. So today is not specifically going to be a how to use these programs. It's more going to be set up as this is what we have available, and these are the type of questions that can be answered using various software, as well as a quick just tour around these parts of the website that are pertaining to this specifically. All right, so with that said, I'll start talking about. So as I said, talking about these are just the applications today. These are the basic ones that come with bearing selection and application setup. So there'll be bearing select, SimPro quick, Lube select, DialSet, which is for lubrication settings, mobile apps that are available, and a thing called SKF Shelf, as I said. Then we'll look through the website and we'll do a couple of examples on some of our programs. So quickly, this is a bit of a flow chart of what we have available at SKF. We're constantly developing new software that's going to be available. As you can see from this chart, some of it's the top two, that's SKF internal. SimPro Expert will probably not be accessible to most of you, but SimPro Quick and all the online tools are available. Some of them are just free to use. Some of them require a free registration, and some of them, SimPro Quick is license-based. So that's something that if you've got an interest in, you can contact us afterwards and we can start working that out. So this is sort of a hierarchy of the different programs that we're going to go through. We're mainly going to be concentrating on the bottom two sections today. There are needs, because if anything's going more complicated than that, the recommendation would be to contact your local SKF application engineer to help you work through it. All right, so firstly we'll go into, this is Bearing Select software package. I'm going to go through an example of this later, so I just want to briefly bring up what sort of calculations this software can be used for. It can be used for either single bearing and two bearings. Now, a lot of you, or some of you, may be familiar with Bearing Select. Last year it was updated. We also had a program that we used to call SKF Bearing Calculator, one that I found very, very handy myself. What's basically happened is last year they've merged those two programs. So if you're familiar with Bearing Select or Bearing Calculator, the calculations you would have found on either of those are now found both within Bearing Select, because they both did very similar things. So we thought, rather than having two that were not up to, maybe not have every single piece of information in one, and this will save you bouncing from one to the other. Now they're both in one position. So what you can do with these, with either a one bearing setup or a two bearing system, is you can do life calculations. You can do grease life or lubrication intervals. So grease life if it's a sealed bearing, and lubrication, re-lubrication intervals if you've got an open bearing, or that sort of setup. You can do minimum load calculations. We can work out the operating viscosity, which will help us determine if we're using the right lubricant. You can use it to find out your bearing frequencies, so that for when you're doing condition monitoring, as long as you know the bearing number and you know the RPM, then you can use this to find the bearing frequencies that you'll use when you're doing your condition monitoring. The static safety calculations, adjusted reference speed calculations when taking into account different lubricants with your bearing, and then some basic friction calculations. This would be, our second one is SimPro Quick. So this is a downloadable program that you need a license to use. This has a little bit more in depth than Bearing Select. You can do the calculations available on Bearing Select, but this has a bit more of a modeling style feature and a few more a bit more in-depth calculation when you do it online. Again, I'll be going through I have a model set up that we can have a look at, just to navigate through the program later. So hopefully you can sort of see what functionality that has. But as you can see, on top of the calculations we talked about before, the main ones that are different is, so they're all a little bit more in depth, or you can get things where you can see how much of your bearing is loaded by the loaded zone calculations. You can see the contact stresses. You get an output for that on both graphically and numerically in the outputs. As you can see, they're the other things that we have. And shaft deflection is also an extra that is not included in Bearing Select, but you can do on SimPro Quick. So these are some of the calculations. It's a little bit more complicated to use, but it does have a lot more functionality. So that's available, and it's good to know. But that's something that it's a program that needs to be downloaded, and licenses are required to use it. So now we're into the lubrication portion. So Lube Select here, this program is available online for free. I think you might need to log in for this one, but the login, it doesn't cost anything, so that's available. So what this one does, you've got basically two options. If you know the specific application details of your bearing or your machine, you can put those details in, so you have a more specific recommendation. So what this one is, it concentrates on the SKF greases, but what we'll do for a set number of conditions, and when I'm saying conditions, you can also include things like requirement for water resistance, high temperature, high speed, contamination, food grade, etc. Like all of those things get taken into consideration, and it'll output the recommended grease products. And if you can give specific details on the application as well in terms of load and speed, it can calculate the grease relubrication interval. So this is quite handy. It takes into account some of the multipliers that we would normally take into account when doing these lubrications manually, and use it online. Also, you can do it based, if you don't know the specifics of your application, so this would be more end user based. If you know you've got a conveyor, or you know you've got a crusher, application profiles can be used. Knowing the machine type can be used, and we get they're a much more general recommendation, because the less specific the information you put in, the less specific the answer will be. But you can still get general lubrication grease product suggestions based on this. It'll come up with a suitability chart, and you can see in which areas specific greases are positive, and where they work well, and certain downsides certain greases have in certain applications. So this is why we have greases for different applications. The next program I want to talk to you about is DialSet. DialSet. So DialSet specifically, it is a program that is used solely for the determination of relubrication calculations. I find this program very handy myself. I use it quite a lot to do relubrication calculations. What you do is this is doing one bearing at a time. You can put in all your information. So if you know your grease, you can select it here if you're using an SKF grease. If you're using an SKF automatic lubricator, you can also set it here. So this is primarily used for our System 24 TLMR and different automatic lubricators for single point. But what I would say as well is, if you're not using one of those, you can use this software, and by putting in the application conditions here, so you've got your speed, your hours of operation, your bearing operating temperature, details like contamination, load, shock load, average ambient temperature, or the ambient temperature, shaft orientation, how you will re-grease it, and which side's rotating. And down here you get results for how much lubrication you should be using. The one thing I'll say about both Lube Select and DialSet is any relubrication interval you get here would be an intelligent thing to use as a starting point. In application and in reality and in service, these things can vary quite often. So it's a good starting point, but you might find that you're using too much. You're seeing a lot of purging of fresh grease, at which point you can dial it down, or you might have a lot of contamination. So a lot of times when contamination is an issue, this is just a start point. If you're finding things are operating too hot, or based on the information given, it might be that the numbers are too hot. The grease relubrication rate is too frequent. One of the handy things about DialSet is by making adjustments to these sections here, as you can see by the answers given, that there's no specific numbers. It's high, medium, low, or contamination, low, moderate, high. Load would be low, moderate, high, very high, and the same with ambient temperature. You can see the small effects that making small changes to each of those can have on your lubrication rate. Because if you look, this is what the setting would be if you're using a specific item, but here under relubrication interval and then or a feed per day, you still actually get an absolute answer for if you're not using one of these systems. So it becomes a very handy tool to use for that. I like that you can compare small adjustments and see what effect they have. And by doing that, you can see, okay, if I've set it up in this way, but I'm not 100% sure on this operating condition, I know that I can be, all right, it's medium to low or it's medium to high. I'll know if I'm in that range, I can be okay. So it's a good way to see the difference that these small calculations can make and these small different operating conditions can make. So I find this one to be a very handy tool. So this is free online as well. You don't think you need to log in for this one, but this is, yeah, it's on SKF. We'll show you where that is in a moment. One of the other things that SKF has that can be very handy to use for a lot of things is you can actually download a lot of mobile apps. Most of these are available for Apple and Android devices. They range from product information and catalogs to help with smaller versions of the product selection, such as Bearing Select and Lube Select. As you can see there on the bottom, you've got Bearing Calculator as well. Different service tools, whether they're used for installation and alignment, things like pulleys and motors, but couplings as well are available. Industry-specific tools, whether that be a couple of examples, there's some wind or automotive, mining as well. There's different industry tools available on there. That's just a small example. And also you can download something called SKF Shelf, which I'm going to go into more detail of here. This one's a very handy app. You can have it on your phone or your tablet. It's available on Apple and Android, Google devices. What SKF Shelf is an app where you can download and store all the external SKF catalogs that we have available for this program. They're arranged in a way that you can search and download, whether they be product catalogs or technical information guides to specific applications or specific bearings or specific industries. So there's a lot of information that's available out there. It can be a little bit easier sometimes than the website to navigate, and also you can take it on the run using it on your phone. So as you can see here, this is just a quick screenshot of some of this one would be just showing that you can download these brochures and have them available for the different products. So these are some of the products that I just quickly downloaded. So you've got, as you can see here, housings, bearings, and there's some services and Y bearing units, and there's also different industries. So that's why SKF Shelf, it's mobile, so it's a really handy thing if you ever need to get information on the run. That basically ends the presentation portion of this webinar. I'm going to quickly go through some examples on Bearing Select and SimPro quick. So I'm going to start with Bearing Select. So I'm just going to bring that across. So actually, firstly, before we go into that, this is just quickly how to find this information. The information is available. So this is SKF's homepage. From here, you can see the different tabs. So if we're just looking at products, they're here. Some service information is under services, but what we're going to do for these programs, they're under support and they're engineering tools. So if we scroll down to engineering tools, you can actually filter them because there's quite a lot. There's a lot of these. I've just gone through the ones that I find most important for the bearing selection process today, but you can also filter through things like lubrication. So there's a few of the programs there we talked about. DialSet, Lube Select for SKF greases is both there. So if I go to bearing and units, I will find Bearing Select here, and as you can see, there's a few other options there as well. Some of them are internally based, but most of the ones that are here, the ones you can use. So if I was to go to Bearing Select, it would bring me up here, but I've already logged in, so it comes to here. When we're using Bearing Select, sorry, I just saw something come up. Anyway, so I'm going to go, this is the single bearing input. So from here, you can choose the type of bearing you're using. And I'm just going to quickly go through. Sorry, I just got distracted. Someone's asking for control. So for this one, I'm just going to put through a known bearing for us. So you can search by part number, you can search by size here. But for this case, I'm going to go just for a 22224 spherical bearing with a parallel bore. Now in this slide, this is where we can select which calculations we want to use. So for whichever we want to use, the inputs that you're required to put in will be based on the selections that you make here. So you can have minimum load, bearing frequencies, viscosity, grease life, we'll go equivalent dynamic load, and we'll go bearing life for this one. We may as well put through friction as well. Now that those selections have been made, the inputs that you need to put in here may vary depending on specifically what you put in. So for this one, I've just picked some numbers. So we'll say it's got a 40 kilonewton radial load, 5 kilonewton axial load, 450 RPM, and I'm just going to leave the temperature as it is. I'm going to leave it as grease lubricated here, but what you can do is you can select your grease oil with filter, oil without. You can select whether it's an SKF grease or whether it's based on viscosities, known viscosity values. If it's SKF greases, the selections are available here. Also, we have different contamination models that can use, including, but this is so you can set your contamination. So we'll just change that to slight and typical just because we can. So now that we've done that, the warnings go away here and we can click calculate. As I say, this is a fairly simple program to use. And now that we've done that, once the loading's done, we'll get some brief answers here. So the results pop up down the bottom here briefly. Oh, sorry, that's disappeared on me. So I'll just type them back in again. There we go. And there, all your results come down here. So we get results for each of the things we selected, including slight warnings if something may or may not be required to be changed, or at least in some cases it might be just something that needs to be considered. For example, here you see for rating life results above 100,000 hours, other failure modes than those included in the current rating life models will dominate and limit the life of the bearing. So that's basically talking about things like lubrication, contamination, and making sure your setup of your bearings right, and the fatigue is most likely not going to be the reason that this bearing fails. So in some cases, they're things you don't have to change, and sometimes they're things that you do. These can be exported as projects, as reports. So again, it warns you to check the errors before you move on. You have to be logged in to do a report, but you just click here and you can download a report. So I'll just do that so you can see. I'm not going to include these for now, but if you wanted to I'll put test report and my name. And if I go download, hopefully this is quick today. This generates the report. One thing I would say as well is that you can save your details, which I have done for another one. So this has popped up, and this is how the report comes out, which can be handy for yourself, can be handy to save just as a PDF, handy if you're dealing with your customers or depending on what you want to use it for, or just to present to your boss, or just to keep it in your file so you know whether you've made the right selection. So that's how that outputs. So that's for a one bearing. What I will show you now, I saved this one earlier. So had I saved that, it shows up down here at the bottom, so I can open existing projects. So I've done a trial for a 2 bearing on a shaft as well, just to show you slightly differently how it shows up. Now we can select 2 bearings, we can set our bearing distances, and we can put in a load case and temperature. Similarly to the previous, I also selected the calculations that I would use, similar ones to before. And this one I've just done with oil, that's because I've put it at a higher speed so you can check. But what I'll show you is this is again. So this is basically it's basically the same concept, but when you're doing the bearing selection, you have to put in 2, and your loads are slightly different. One of the good things about this is you can actually add load cases, so you can do different condition settings for when they're operating. So that can be a very handy way to show, okay, if it's say 50% of the time it's doing this, or 25% of the time it's doing this. Or yeah, so if I've got 1 and 1, that's going evenly, and if I can go 2 and 1, so if it's going one's going twice as long as other. So that's one of the handy things about Bearing Select when you're doing two bearings in the application. So that's, other than that, it has the same functionality as the typical Bearing Select for one bearing. Again, if you wanted to generate the report, I don't know if I mentioned this, but you have to be logged in, but it is free. You just have to be logged in to do it. Okay, so that's about all I'm going to do on Bearing Select for now. I'm going to briefly show you a model of SimPro Quick. This is not going to be a how-to guide because that would take a while, but what I would say is that if you are interested in this, there is a pretty comprehensive help file on there. I just want to get you to see some of the functionality. As you can sort of see, it's a bit more of a model than Bearing Select. For this one, just a conveyor pulley mock-up that I've put together. You input loads by dragging some of the icons. You add a speed. I've put 2 bearings in, one's fixed, one's floating, and individual housings. You can have it set it up if you've got a single housing. I drag, so a lot of this is drag and drop on this software. It'll work. Sorry, the server's been a bit fun today. So, oh, there we go, good. Obviously that won't work with the conveyor pulley, but you can, if you're doing like a fan barrel housing, that's a calculation you can do. So we put this is how we put bearings in. What the functionality of this also includes, you can do gears. You can add springs to bearings, which is handy when you've got minimum load concerns, or you're using things like angular contact bearings or thrust bearings or taper bearings. The same thing with these spacers that you can put in that help to, you can do different setups. So you can do calculations based on or what you can actually do is you can vary the spacer or the axial displacement on like a thrust bearing, a taper roller bearing, angular contact bearing, and see the results, or see the effect that doing that will have on your results. We add speeds and forces. You can also add in gear forces. So if I put in a gear, I can drag in a gear force and the resultant belt pulley force. We can put a moment in, and then we fix and ground things. What we can also do down the bottom is you can set different parameters. So that's building the shaft is fairly simple on this. What we put in the housing and outer dimensions, and then turn out with and the housings are grounded. And then we just choose whether the fit is clear. We've selected our bearings. Boundary is just to do with all of the reactions and forces that are within the system. We can set up a grease. What we can do is we can either use SKF standard greases, or you can input details manually to work out if you've got a different grease. So I'm just going to use an SKF normal grease in this case. And then you select your grease for your bearing there. You can also set up your different fits and clearances in terms of bearing clearance, as well as your fits within the housings and on the shaft. This can help you determine the effect that different clearances or different running different tolerances can have when you're running, and whether you will have how that will affect both bearing life and also things like contact loads, contact points, contact stresses inside the bearing. That can be shown both numerically and graphically. There's also material calculations if you're looking at if you wanted to go a bit further on bearing steel or the shaft steel, but I'm not going to do that for now. So in terms of the analysis that you can use this for, again, like the previous, you can add load cases. So if I wanted to add 2 load cases, and then I could put in different forces for each of those, so that there's different, so that when you do generate your reports, you can see the effect at slight different conditions, or if it's 2 hours, it's operating like this, 4 hours, it's operating like this, you can actually see that there's different, what the resultant life of the whole thing is expected to be by calculating that. So I'll just undo that anyway for now, because it'll take too long to calculate if I try to show it. You can also, if you just have purely what you've modeled, then static analysis is the choice for you. axial pre-displacement is not really worth it in what we've done now, because it's only working for angular contacts and taper rollers. So basically that can help when you're trying to determine things like your spacer sizes and your preload before your bearing, and see the effects that that might have on bearing life and in the operation right. So when we go to this, we go to save. So I haven't changed anything, so it should work. It'll just take a moment, sorry, because of the service, but we basically, this is the report format that comes through. If the calculations, this pops up when the calculations are done, so the calculations are finished. You can edit, you can fully edit what report, how the report shows what it comes, what sends. Unfortunately, there has been an error because of the update, but the error is resulting. So we've got an issue about the high kappa value there. It's just saying that above kappa value of 4, you're not going to see too much improvement beyond that. So it's just a heads up. But we have things in here. You can scroll by what answer you want. So if I go, I want to know what the loads are, it tells me what loads are on each bearing. If I want to know the bearing life, I can see the expected bearing life based on what I've done there. I didn't put in enough details to work out the frictional moment on this one, but that's something you can do. Again, as I said, there's a pretty in detailed help model about how to use this. I'm just trying to get across what you can use it for. One other thing I'd say is what this allows is you can see a graphical representation of your system. You can also see an animation. I assume it's okay, depending on, I put on low, you can exaggerate when it's an operation. That doesn't want to work today. But you can see, anyway, you can see oh, there we go. So that's obviously exaggerated. If we look at it from a different angle, you can actually see, zoom in, you can see, okay, these rollers are the ones that are loaded, and you can see the extremities. You can actually adjust this as well to see, make it so that you can actually get more of a variation between it. So then you can see, so by changing that, so you can see in that where the bearings are going to be. Again, it's at a single point, but you can see where the bearings are loaded and how. We have some of these others. So this is basically just a shaft deflection chart. This shows the bearing contact loads at different spots for different bearings and even for different rows. The deformation within the bearing contact angles, and also rating life, which I haven't put, because I haven't put in the actual displacement. There's no variation. So you can actually chart how your bearing life might change based on that. So that's basically SimPro in a quick nutshell, giving an idea of some of the things you can do and some of the modifications you can do. That's all I have for today. We'll have a look at some questions. If you've got any, feel free to add them into the chat, and I'll try and go through them as best as I can. If not, I'll see if I can answer them. So